It's time to explore wrestling's past and potential future with your weekly dose of a segment we call What If? Only found here on the WWE Podcast.
All right, welcome to the WWE Podcast, and this is the What If segment for the week. And once again, if you're listening to this, that means you're exclusive to Patreon. Thank you so much for joining. And as always, I've got Anthony DeMarco here to cover a topic we've never discussed ever. I don't think even maybe in passing, but certainly not at length. And that is, what if all of the WCW stars came in 2001 and there wasn't this kind of, second wave with the big stars at the back end. So, Anthony, welcome to the show. I'm sure you're excited about this one.
I am, Matt, and I think it's because this entire angle is probably one of the most polarizing angles WWE ever did, because it was a highly anticipated angle all the way through the Monday Night Wars 97, 98, 99 when this was going on. By 2000, WWF had kind of taken the torch and run with it away from WCW and really largened the gap. But we all anticipated it, but when it finally came to fruition, it was obviously the best that WWF could do with it. Like Vince McMahon, obviously this was kind of out of his control. But when we look back on it now, it was really like we didn't get what we were expecting. To your point, we ultimately got, the NWO come in and Ric Flair come back and Goldberg, and in the much later time, Sting. But we really missed out on that head-to-head collision of both top company stars matching up against one another in the actual invasion angle itself.
Oh, yeah. And that was, I remember watching, just saying, hey, where the hell is Hogan? Where's Nash? Where's Hall? Where is Goldberg, for God's sakes? And yes, we did eventually get all them, as you said, but it's kind of like, oh man, like you took the steam out of what could have been epic. And certainly, as you said, it is a polarizing angle, because even Jim Ross has talked about this many times on his show. And he said, hey, we recognize that we probably could have done a lot better with the invasion angle, and things got really watered down with specific referees that have to be from WCW, and the announce team can't be WWF, and like they went too far with the whole invasion angle. And I think that if they had a second crack at it, that they would have definitely executed it differently. However, even if it was executed better, the topic at hand that we're discussing right now of bringing in those stars, if it was possible in 2001, looking at Hogan and Goldberg and Flair and among others, it's like, man, what could have been, right? Like, what would have happened? What do you think would have happened in general?
Well, for one thing, if we're going to include Talon, I'm going to include Eric Bischoff in this, because he kind of was the Vince McMahon equivalent over in WCW, guiding Nitro through the Monday Night War. So I think the first thing would have been, I don't know if Shane McMahon would have been as prevalent as a character as he ended up being, because if you remember, the whole kickoff to this angle in a very long-term booking type of way started in March of 2001 on the build to WrestleMania 17, when they booked McMahon versus McMahon, Shane versus Vince, and it was revealed on that infamous clip of Monday Night Raw of, the simulcast of Shane McMahon, obviously in kayfabe, revealing himself to be the new owner of WCW. So I really think that if we go kind of, time frame by time frame and how this entire angle unfolded, that would have been the first big major difference, is if they were able to bring in Eric Bischoff right off the hop, which they ultimately did in the summer of 2002. I don't think that Shane McMahon would have played as big of a role as he ended up doing.
Probably not. And maybe even Stephanie, who was the, quote, owner of ECW when that was brought in, which, I mean, once they tried to resurrect ECW, that could be a whole nother conversation. That's a disaster, I think, in, 2008 or so. So certainly Shane McMahon probably wouldn't have been as prevalent. At the same time, I do enjoy Shane McMahon on TV. At that time, I did enjoy him on TV. He was a really, really good heel. But he was going against Vince McMahon. So it was really, as always, a family duo, a family affair with the McMahons in each corner of, trying to bide for control of the company. And looking back, I guess I'd have to look at all of the Monday Night Raws that led into the invasion angle. But I look back on this with somewhat nostalgia, and everything kind of gets put through rose-colored glasses when you look back. You're like, oh, things were so much better. But were they really, right? Like, I'd have to watch things back on episode by episode basis to decide if this was a disaster or if it was something that was not given enough credit. But yeah, the stars and not being able to bring in the top guys. I mean, stars are what drive any sport at all. And when you don't have those top stars, it hurts business, and fans are going, hey, where are the guys that we really want? And yeah, they had DDP. They kind of had that upper mid-tier equivalent, and it was fine. And we had Austin turn heel in there and eventually lead the alliance. But yeah, it was, I don't know. I think back and I go, it was okay. There were certain moments, like the one with Austin clearing the ring, and he was going to lead WWF into Invasion, and he stunned like 18 people in the ring. That was one of the, to me, the funniest moments of Austin's career and best. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
Well, you bring up ECW and how Stephanie McMahon was revealed, obviously, on screen as the owner, and Paul Heyman, who was already on the commentary team at this time. Very underrated team, him and JR. I remember they were the team to call WrestleMania 17, and Heyman as like the color guy was just awesome in that role. And then they revealed him to be kind of like the mastermind of bringing ECW, back to life. And I think we would not have seen ECW involved in that angle had Sting, the NWO, and Goldberg come over, because they really resurrected ECW kind of as a necessity, because WWF had a lot of pre-existing former ECW guys on their roster, most notably the Dudley Boys, Rhino, Raven. These were guys that had been in ECW long before. So, and I remember there was that famous clip of, WCW guys like beating down the WWF guys. I believe it was like Undertaker and Kane. And then the WWF locker room come running out, being the Dudleys, Rhino, and Raven. But lo and behold, they're former ECW guys, and they join the Alliance. And then, we get into the Invasion pay-per-view, a pay-per-view I've seen probably 30 times. I used to own that DVD when I was younger. Well, I still do own it, but I've watched it so many times. And Team Alliance was Booker T, Diamond Dallas Page, Rhino, and the Dudley Boys, with Rhino and the Dudley Boys representing ECW. And to your point, the biggest stars that WCW was able to bring in were DDP and Booker T. And obviously, at the tail end of WCW, like Booker T had won the championship 5 times. And Diamond Dallas Page had worked his way up to the main event card. Like, if you watch Ready to Rumble, he was the main heel in that movie, a movie I've seen over 100 times. But I love that movie, on a side note. But I don't think we would have seen guys that were ECW alumni like the Dudleys and Rhino being so prevalent in the storyline. And to be honest, they probably would have stayed on Team WWF, because they wouldn't have had such a desperate need for, relatively big names to be the counterparts to Austin and Angle and Jericho and whatnot. So do you think that ECW would have played as big of a role if they got all of the WCW talent?
Yeah, probably not. They did, like you said, they brought over WWF talent that were the ECW originals, and then said, "Hey, we're going back to, we're going back to our roots, and we're supporting ECW," because they had to, like you said. I mean, without the Dudley Boys specifically and RVD, I think that and Taz, among others, I don't think that they would have been as they wouldn't have felt as much of a force if it was just kind of like the guys that WWF fans may not have known, like the Sandman. I mean, well, most people know the Sandman, but you have guys that aren't as I guess they don't have that star power. They don't have that brand recognition that a lot of people knew about, like I said, the Dudley Boys and others. So yeah, I don't think ECW would have been a big enough factor. And even still, even though they did bring those guys over and at least give a little bit of power to the ECW brand, I still think that ECW felt like the third wheel in this, because I felt like it was still more about WCW versus WWF as the Monday Night Wars raged on. I mean, ECW never really threatened the ratings of either brand or either company, and ECW was kind of the redheaded stepchild of the three, and it was fun to see them. And it's always a kind of a fantasy booking to have that rivalry, and that's what we saw play out. But I think that it's really about WCW and WWF going head to head in competition rather than ECW. But I'm not against it. I think they did what they could with the talent they had, and they brought in some stars. I mean, like I said, RVD went on to have one of the best careers from migrating from ECW. So.
And you're absolutely right, because even if you remember, let's say back to 2 or 3 years prior, ECW and WWF actually had some cross promotion going on Monday Night Raw, and then it was revealed in the later years that Vince had loaned Heyman money to kind of get them to their first pay-per-view, if I'm not mistaken. So if you followed it in that regard, you're just like, well, if they were involved, wouldn't they kind of be helping WWF, as logic would dictate? But, again, as we reiterated several times already, they needed it. And from a real life story perspective, they couldn't afford to just, roll with Booker T, DDP, Sean O'Hare, Chuck Palumbo, and Buff Bagwell, and that was kind of like the cream of the crop, or like Canyon, or, I forget the other ones, Lance Storm, I think even Lance Storm was ECW. So because you look at that inaugural brawl, I remember it was 5-on-5 at Invasion, the one that Austin ultimately ended up returning heel as they kind of doubled down on the heel run for Austin. And it was a mismatch. Like, you had DDP, Booker T, the Dudleys, and Rhino on one side against Austin, Angle, Jericho, and the Brothers of Destruction. You look on paper, you're just like, what the hell is this, man? How could this be at all legitimate? And then Austin turns heel. He becomes, basically the leader of the alliance. And they basically do that because they know that they have The Rock coming back the very next week on Monday Night Raw. And we see him do kind of like the swerve where it looks like he's going to join the alliance. And eventually the alliance, or rather the Invasion angle, kind of broke down to centered around 4 guys. You have The Rock and Jericho leading WWF, and then Austin and eventually Kurt Angle leading the alliance. And it really became about those 4 as 2001 played out. And I still think, obviously Austin, Rock were made men by that time. But in terms of Jericho and Kurt Angle, and in the immediate future, it significantly impacted Jericho becoming the first ever undisputed champion. But I think that those 2 guys, and probably Rob Van Dam, to your earlier point, really benefited the most of that entire angle and really catapulted them, even though they had already both been one-time WWF champions before this angle. It really solidified them as main event guys, and they obviously went on to have Hall of Fame level careers, both of them respectively. So I ask you, had Sting and, let's say, the NWO and Flair and Goldberg all come in, and even a guy like Scott Steiner all come in at the same time as the original WCW angle with Booker T and DDP, and along with Triple H maybe being healthy, because we forget he missed that entire angle with his quad injury, do you think it would have maybe kept guys like Angle and Jericho from reaching their full potential?
Well, they're so good, I don't think so. But as I'm imagining the entire WCW roster, the star-studded, top of the top, cream of the crop guys that we all wanted to see come in. If I'm imagining this scenario, I mean, I could imagine probably the highest rated Raw of all time would have taken place if that was to happen, say, in the final 20 minutes of a Monday Night Raw, where you have everyone one by one come out, and then they're face to face with Austin, they're face to face with Rock, they're face to face with Undertaker and Kane and Jericho and Angle, and it is a true, like, you have all 5 guys staring at each other from across the ring, and imagine that the crowd reaction to that, where all 5 of those guys on both ends. And I guess you could pick the 5 guys at your will with WCW. I'm guessing it would be the entire NWO. So there's 3 guys. It would be maybe Sting and Goldberg. There's your 5, and you'd have Austin, you'd have Rock, you'd have Angle, you'd have Jericho, Undertaker, well, if Triple H wasn't injured, as you said too. Yeah, I mean, so it would have been a moment for the ages had that actually happened. But as we know, the reason they didn't bring them in is because they had guaranteed contracts with AOL, Time Warner. Who was it? Who's the guy that Ted Turner, who owned WCW? They had guaranteed money. They're sitting home collecting a check, so they didn't bring them in because they didn't want to buy out their contracts just to pay them for their contract for WWF. So, I mean, they were just sitting at home until they were, of course, all brought in. And NWO came in 2002, and Goldberg came in 2003. Was he 2003? When did Goldberg? Yeah, 2003 with The Rock coming in at the end of Raw. I remember that. So certainly it was thinking about what could have been. It would have been an iconic moment that would probably be, I think, in the signature start of every Monday Night Raw now. I mean, like, it would be a quick blip of it, but it would be one of those images that you just never forget.
It's so crazy to think about. And it would, because now that we're actually talking about, like, these dream scenario matches, because the 5-on-5 match ultimately ended up being at Survivor Series. On Team WWF, you had The Rock, Chris Jericho, Big Show, Undertaker, Kane. And then on Team Alliance, you had Austin, Angle, Rob Van Dam, Booker T, and Shane McMahon. And if you look at it, the only true WCW guy from there is Booker T, which is kind of sad to think about. And obviously Van Dam was an ECW guy, and that really kind of launched him into the main event scene, or at least the upper mid card. He still was an ECW guy. And as you said before, it's like ECW, yeah, it's cool that they were there and you respect what they did and all that, but that's not the battle people wanted to see. And it's sad to say, because I think Booker T is another guy who really benefited from these guys not being there. And we already outlined, if all those guys come over, Booker T's not involved in this match. You know, does Booker T have the feud with The Rock, where The Rock beats him for the WCW Championship at SummerSlam 2001? And then they have the match with Shane McMahon the following pay-per-view at Unforgiven. Like, The Rock and Booker T had a fairly significant rivalry upon The Rock's return in 2001 when he chose Team WWF. And I guess we could shift it over to Booker T. Like, Booker T specifically, who I would say was this most successful WCW star to come in during the Invasion angle and go on to have just an incredible WWE career. So do you think arguably Booker T is the one who benefited the most from those aforementioned stars not coming over right away?
Well, I can't think of anybody else that even came close to what Booker T did coming from WCW. And there was a lot of guys that came in and they were a flash in the pan and gone. I mean, I can't tell you how many there were that were in the Invasion angle that I bet you if we watched it back, you'd go, oh my God, that's right. And we could mention like 15 people and go, yeah, they didn't really amount to much and they were let go after a short period of time. But Booker T, no question. And I've really never even dove into his career on this show. And I really should, because he has done some things. Again, in WWE, I wasn't watching WCW back in the day. I was strictly WWF. But that said, I do think that Booker T is absolutely deserving of the Hall of Fame accolades that he has. And with all the grocery store moments with Stone Cold Steve Austin, I mean, that was just one of the most ridiculous things that I've ever seen, and hilarious, and a change of pace for both guys. Although I do hold a personal grudge against Booker T, because he actually injured accidentally Austin, dropping him on a table, I believe, the announce table, injuring Austin's back. I think he broke one of Austin's bones in his back, and I hold him personally accountable, because that very next week, he was supposed to come down to Albany, New York for it was just a house show. In Austin, they had big posters on the door that Stone Cold was not going to be there. So if you want a refund, go to the, Ticketmaster or wherever, or go to the box office. I'm like, you mother, right? I was so pissed. So I still hold a grudge that I never got to see Austin that day because of Booker T injuring him the week before. That said, Booker T is a legend, no question about it. I mean, him and The Rock with the bookend versus the Rock Bottom, the feud with Stone Cold. Booker T had a hell of a career. Of course, King Booker, we all remember that very well. Probably the best ever to win a King of the Ring and then translate it perfectly into his character. I mean, it's not like King Corbin. So definitely, no question.
And another guy who ultimately did end up in WWE, and I would argue has had his best run, well, depending who you ask. If you ask him, he probably says it's his best run, but if you ask the fans, they'd probably say it's his worst run, is a guy like Goldberg when he came back in 2016. And he has arguably done more since his return to the company than or I think it was 2017 actually. Or no, it was end of 2016. And people forget that his initial run with the company only lasted a year. He came back the night after WrestleMania 19, confronted The Rock the night after Stone Cold's retirement, had kind of a year-long run at the top of Monday Night Raw, primarily against Triple H, had the infamous match with Brock Lesnar, and then went away for 12 and a half years. And if he had come in right away, you would have to think they would have done Goldberg for Stone Cold Steve Austin, if not for anything else, just the way they look. Similar guys, we've often seen them talk about it. And even their characters somewhat paralleled. Obviously, Austin had much more dimensions. It was much more over. But there were some parallels between the two. So I ask you kind of a two-part question. A, do you think that Goldberg would have had a more successful first run with the company had he come over right away? And do you think that Stone Cold Steve Austin and him for sure would have been on a collision course?
Yeah, second question first. I think they definitely would have been on a collision course. I think if he came in when all the fans wanted him to, that Austin was still an active competitor. So I think it would have been inevitable, and I don't think that Goldberg would have had the bad taste in his mouth leaving WWF that he did the first time around. So certainly Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Goldberg was on the table, and they missed each other by just a sliver of a year and a half or so, simply because of the timing of the contract and when Austin retired in 2003 in Seattle. So, yeah, that absolutely would have happened. And I think to answer your first question, I think Goldberg would have benefited much more to come in when he was, I want to say supposed to, because that's not really for us to decide, but when the fans wanted him to. And imagine that stare off between him and Austin. Again, the fans, it would have, I can't even imagine the reaction and the ratings. It would have been epic. I think it would have beat out the Rock, This Is Your Life, which was one of the most watched segments of all time. So yes, to both questions, and it's a sad thing that we didn't get it, other than a Stone Cold Stunner to Goldberg in 2004.
It was always crazy to me how quickly the NWO came in following the invasion angle. They first showed up at, what was it, No Way Out 2001, if I'm not mistaken? Or 2002, rather? And, they missed the invasion angle by a handful of months. So in a lot of ways, we kind of got what we would have if the NWO had showed up, maybe 8 months prior, right? We would have probably gotten Rock versus Hogan. We probably would have gotten Scott Hall versus against Stone Cold Steve Austin. But do you think had they showed up right in the thick of the invasion angle and they were on, Team WWF at, let's say, the Invasion pay-per-view and at Survivor Series, it would have changed the trajectory at all of those three competitors as to what ultimately played out in 2002?
Maybe. And again, I point to the match that I think most people would look at and go, how did this not happen? And that's Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Hulk Hogan. How did that not happen? Now, I understand, and we've all seen the match between The Rock and Hulk Hogan in Toronto, where the fans turned on The Rock, and it was the start of his heel turn, and Hogan was the homecoming hero. No matter what he did, I mean, the fans were just 100% behind him, and one of the most just crazy crowd reactions you'll ever see. And I still think, even as great as that was, I still think it should have been Stone Cold. I would trade a Stone Cold match with Hulk Hogan any day of the week for a Rock versus Hogan. And I understand The Rock and Hogan, they had good chemistry, and I had no problem with the match. But how do you not take two guys at the top of their, well, I don't want to say Hogan was at the top of his game, but Austin was at the top of his game, and you take two guys of the heads of their generation when they're both active and not have it happen? It was a crime that should be, somebody needs to go to jail for this not happening. And I think that Stone Cold has admitted years later that he just wasn't, quote, in the right headspace, whatever that means. I know he was going through multiple divorces, probably had a real drinking problem, burned out, he's injured. I get it. So that's a lot of the reason, and probably the reason it didn't happen. Among the fact that I think Austin wanted to go over, and he also said he was worried about the quality of the match, as he had very high standards going in the ring with Terry Bollea at an advanced age, let's say. But as far as the trajectory of those three guys, I think we would have seen possibly a better chance at Hogan and Austin, given that it would have been almost a year earlier, and maybe things would have been different with Austin. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, they always play second fiddle in that group, and I don't think with those two guys it would have really changed much. I think Hogan may have changed a little bit in terms of we would have got that dream match, and I don't know if Rock Hogan actually happens. It still may have. I would think it would have, given that he hung around in time for The Rock to come back from making his movie and yada yada yada. And we all know, but I think that, yeah, this would have been a match that we missed by 8 months, as you said.
And it's the one that held out the longest before ultimately coming back, or just arriving in WWE, was Sting. He ultimately comes back in late 2014, and he has, the program with Triple H. He has the short-lived feud with Seth Rollins when he got injured in real life off the buckle bomb. And his entire WWE run, lasted an entirety of 9 months, that culminated at Night of Champions in 2015. But had he come back, I keep saying come back, had he showed up for the first time in 2001, you have to think him and Undertaker finally would have had that match, right?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. That, again, this would have been insane, right? Because yeah. I mean, think about the management of trying to take all of this insane, just really an impossibly stacked roster, and trying to manipulate and move all the pieces in the right place. They would have not had enough time to do all of these things. I mean, I don't even know if it's seriously conceivable. It would have just been a Hall of Famer versus Hall of Famer, Hall of Famer versus Hall of Famer. It would have been seriously just like video game-esque type of matches that I really don't know how they would have done it all. If we're playing pretend here, but if all of them came in at once and all of the WWF talent was there, The Rock was there, Triple H wasn't injured, it would have been one of the most remarkable years or longer in the history of professional wrestling as an industry. It would have been absolutely mind-boggling, the type of matches we're getting on a weekly basis. I mean, I'm telling you, the Monday Night Raws would have been WrestleMania main event worthy today. And we've seen that. I mean, if you look back at some of the things that happened in the Attitude and Ruthless Aggression era, you're like, that could easily main event WrestleMania, and we took it for granted on a weekly basis. So I don't even remember what your original question was, because I'm just like freaking thinking about the logistics of bringing all these guys in. So what was your question?
The initial question was, do you think that had Sting arrived in 2001, if he would have had a match with The Undertaker?
Yes. Okay. So yes, that's one of the insane matches. Yes, certainly. Yes. Yeah. So one of the probably 6 or 7 that would have been just record breaking in terms of sales and buy rates and everything. Sting and Undertaker definitely do get one of those. I don't even know if it would have been at WrestleMania. I mean, they would have just had no time to build things to WrestleMania because there's just so much to do. But yes, it happens. It would have had to have happened then. I know that even 10, 15 years later, people are still talking about, oh, well, it could happen. He's coming, and it just obviously is impossible. It's a 0% chance now, of course. But when you look back at what could have been with Sting and The Undertaker, that would have been awesome. The only problem that I could foresee with that is in 2001, it was the American Badass, right? So we would have all wanted to see the Dead Man. And that's the persona that he should have faced Sting in, not the American Badass, because it should be dark versus dark. I don't want to see, and I'm a fan of the American Badass. I know some people aren't, but it should be Dead Man versus Sting. That's what we wanted, and he would have had to done a quick turnabout to get himself back to that character.
It's crazy. If he showed up in 2001, I think maybe Sting's first rival would have been Kane, just because The Undertaker was still in American Badass mode. Mm-hmm. But as we're talking here, and we kind of wrap it up, I realized that every wrestler kind of had their direct counterpart in the other promotion. Like we already talked about Undertaker versus Sting, Austin to Goldberg. We ultimately got Rock versus Hogan. But then we look at Triple H, and I'll include him in this argument for the sake of argument, because I know that it's about if we got the WCW talent right away. But what if we include Triple H in this and we say, what if he wasn't injured and he was part of Team WWF? Because when you really look at him alongside the other WWF guys like Undertaker, like Austin, like Rock, you can make the case that there's no guy who's more pure WWF than Triple H. He kind of is being groomed to be the successor of Vince McMahon as far as the talent relations go. So if Triple H was really involved in this angle, who do you think would have been his counterpart on WCW? Like we got him versus Kevin Nash, 2 years later when Kevin Nash was on Raw. We ultimately got him versus Sting. We saw him versus Goldberg. Like, who do you think would have been the guy that he locked horns with the most?
Boy, that's tough because there's also a lot of guys on the WWF side with Austin and Rock and Taker and Kane and Jericho and Angle that could have worked with a lot of the other guys on their counterparts, and you can make a case for a lot of matchups here and a lot of guys that would have in your mind would have worked very well together. Now, initially I'm like, oh, Booker T would have been a good guy, but we did get that. We did get a Booker T versus Triple H main event in what was a very controversial main event. That's a conversation in and of itself. We got who was it? Hulk Hogan versus Triple H. So we did get that match. So I'm trying to think of a guy that he would have immediately locked horns with. Maybe Sean Stasiak? No, probably. Oh boy.
Maybe Razor Ramon, Scott Hall.
It could, yeah, or even Kevin Nash, given the history with the Clique. I think maybe, yeah, well, probably one of the other NWO members, if everyone was there. Yes, I could see Scott Hall, but again, Kevin Nash with the whole Clique thing with Shawn Michaels, definitely yes. We even forget about Shawn Michaels' return, right?
My God, I was just say that.
So
because now that you're saying it, it's like, I'm sorry to cut you off, I'm just so giddy, but like, wouldn't the perfect underlying, let's say, side story be of if we got Shawn Michaels' return 1 year earlier than he ultimately did, so he could be part of this angle?
Oh my God. And
you had D-Generation X versus the NWO, and that kind of broke off. You had, a run-on feud was HBK and Triple H versus Scott Hall and Kevin Nash.
Well,
that was just, yeah.
Don't forget. Ahead. No, we what are you talking about, man? We got this at WrestleMania with him and Sting.
Oh yes. I forgot about this when they were all 50 years old.
Yeah, they're all 50 years old, and Triple H goes over for absolutely no reason. Yes, that still makes absolutely no sense. I watched that match the other day. I'm like, what? Why is Triple H winning here? What, why? Like, it made no sense that Triple H went over. That said, yeah, everybody was basically in their wheelchairs being brought down to the ring. I understand they did what they could. I'm not ranting about it. I think it's, the best they could do at that time, which is what, like, was that WrestleMania 31? I think it was.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's 7 years almost removed. So, but whatever. Certainly when everyone was younger in 01, if Michaels had come back and he would have been in his prime still, it would have, I mean, this is killing me because we're talking about something that all this is what could have been, and then we get this, right? Like, we get a watered down, kind of half-baked version of what could have been, and now I'm like souring on what we did get versus what we could have gotten. But I mean, that's life. But Shawn Michaels coming back earlier, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess like as we wrap it up, and to your point, now that we just fantasize about what we should have / could have gotten, it really makes what we did get kind of a steaming pile of what.
Yeah.
But taking all things into consideration, and that it was ultimately out of the control of Vince McMahon, and they really just did the absolute best that they could have worked with, do you think it was a successful angle, all things considered?
I mean, I'll say this. I don't look at this and go, man, they did a lot of damage with, whoever. I actually don't believe anybody was really damaged from this angle. So there's that. So if you're looking at it and going, man, if this didn't happen, so-and-so would still be here or whatever. I don't look at it and go, people were destroyed by this. I just look at this and go, things could have been so much different if the timing of injuries and returns and contracts, guaranteed contracts that were still just not done yet. I mean, so many different moving parts that were really not far off from one another. I mean, you're talking about 8 to 12 months with a lot of moving parts that could have happened in between. And unfortunately, we got just the kind of warmed over, half baked, it's okay angle. And you know what, if you're going to ask me if it was a success, when I'm looking at the top stars, and that's how I'm gauging it. I mean, of course, you got Austin doing the what thing. The what thing wouldn't have happened without the angle happening when it did. The Rock, who came back, joined the WWF, and kind of was in a transition to Hollywood at that point, turned heel. I mean, it was just a success for him, and what he did with Hogan was a success at WrestleMania. Austin, you could argue, was not successful at WrestleMania 18. In fact, I would argue that was probably Austin's low point of his career, which is insane to think about. But with the Scott Hall matchup, which just we all were, I remember looking at this going, it felt like a mid-card match, and Austin's in it. Yeah, you know what? I would say it's a mild success.
And that's the way I think I would put it too. And I think I guess I just look at what it meant for, let's say, a guy like Chris Jericho, because I think there's no chance in hell that he walks into WrestleMania 18 as the undisputed champion, or that Kurt Angle would be involved in probably the biggest swerve of the angle, where at the end of the day, he's the one that turns his back on WCW and hits Austin with the belt that ends up in the rock bottom to give the WWF the victory. Like, Kurt Angle kind of really got utilized as, the kayfabe double agent in the whole operation, and one of the biggest parts in the ultimate conclusion and payoff of the entire storyline. So, I mean, for guys like Chris Jericho and Kurt Angle and Booker T, I think it really meant a lot for how fast it catapulted them into the main event scene. Obviously sooner for guys like Jericho, as it took maybe Booker T another 5 years to really get to the top of the mountain. But I mean, if I could take some little parts of success as for it being what it was, as opposed to what it could have been had all the original talent come over in the first place, I think at least in the grand scheme of things, we got some good careers in the likes of Angle and Jericho and Booker T.
Yeah. When you look at it like that, and we come back to reality here, which is hard to do, and we leave that fantasy land. Yeah, no, there definitely were some positives, no doubt, of building careers, and like you said, with Angle getting the ultimate victory. And I remember him coming out on Monday Night Raw after saying, why, I'm the reason that we won, and trying to get praise, and saying, that I'm being overlooked and I was the guy that won for everyone. And basically, I think he turned heel again that very next night. Or
exactly.
Yeah. So certainly there was some positives coming out of this. No doubt. Taz on commentary. We eventually transitioned to the commentary booth, which was just awesome. Taz is so damn good.
Great.
Yeah. So. All right. Well, yeah. This is tough, man. I got to say, like, you know, I imagining all these moments that could have been, and now I'm going to go back and watch this with kind of a little bit of a heavy heart, going, oh, what, you know, just thinking about the guys that could have come back. But there are some moments you go, all right, this is pretty damn cool with how long WCW and WWF were separate and going head to head, really battling for their livelihoods in real life, trying to outcompete the other. And now they're in the same company, literally going face to face. It's still a cool moment.
Yeah, but I guess the entire concept of our show always leaves us let down and disappointed, right? Because that's what we do every week.
That's true. Like really the premise of this show is designed to depress people and ourselves.
Pretty much.
like, yeah. So sorry, everybody. Yeah, no. But hey, listen, this has been a blast as always, and we hope we didn't make you just despise this invasion angle, because there were some bright spots. There really were. And you know, the what could be and the what if, pun intended, it does make you wonder. But you know, there are things I'm sure that we aren't thinking about that may have happened, and it's all just kind of, it happened for a reason, right? If you're one of those people that believes that, then this was supposed to happen. And you know, we can always use our WWE 2K22 video game that's coming out. Don't by the way, I haven't had time to play video games, guys. WWE 2K20, I would not recommend that game. I will say that.
Garbage.
It's bad. It's some of the glitches. I remember watching it on Twitter the day it came out, and the glitches are hilarious. Some of them are really, really bad, but funny. So they took 2 years, and this 2K22 better be really, really good.
Yeah, and as far as next week goes, I can't wait to come back and leave more people disappointed.
What a hook, right? Like, there's no better way to sell it, guys. If you need some depression in your life, then you need to look no further. Just come right over here to the What If Show, and we will get you really excited, only to make you realize it's not reality. So, yes, definitely. All right, man. Well, this has been a blast, and we'll be in touch next week.
Sounds good, man. Take care.
Good night.